So I want to start today and to discuss a structure of education which became very popular among Jews in Eastern Europe, and that is the yeshiva, which was a formal educational framework for boys in which they studied Talmud, or generally Talmud, all day. So one could ask, why was it necessary to have a yeshiva if for hundreds of years boys had studied very seriously in communal study halls, in a bet midrash? Why be formal? What's there to gain? So, for that, we have to go back to consider the structure of the bet midrash. Then I'll describe the history of the yeshivot, and we'll see why the structure spread so that by the 20th century it was a almost universal structure of education. Now, how did the bet midrash work? If you recall, the boys studied in the communal study hall, and they ate their meals with local families. And these families would invite students, they would eat, and that way they would support the boys who were studying Talmud, and at the same time they were supervising the boys who were studying Talmud, and boys who studied were invited, and boys who did not study were not invited. And this pattern still exists a little bit. In Jerusalem, at the university, it's very common for families to invite students for meals on Shabbat. And it's very pleasant, you know, they like to talk to young students and to hear what they're doing. But sometimes there is a hidden motive or a hidden goal in these these invitations. And in this way, the university was a little bit like the Bet Midrash. When I was a student, I got to be very good at counting plates. So I would come to somebody's house for a meal, and I would quickly count the plates and see how many people were there and how many plates there were. And why? Very often there was one more plate. And then I knew there was probably going to be a young girl who was going to take that plate. And this was the attempt by the hosts to introduce me to somebody that they would think would be the right person for me. So that different aspects of life mix together. And it was the same thing in the yeshiva. The students studied Talmud out of a belief that it is a holy book, out of belief that it's important. But holy is good, important is good, but it's also important to have a future and to have a job, to have an income, to have a living. What was the future for boys studying Talmud? Now here I'll have to tell you an anecdote in Hebrew. I'll say it in English, but you'll, I hope, get the point. Hebrew, like Ukrainian and not like English, has male and female nouns. English, it's all the same. Now, boys studying Talmud would say that they are studying it for its own purpose, for its own value. And this was in the feminine form. And the older boys would say, no, you're studying Talmud because you want to marry a rich man's daughter. It was very, very common that rich men in a town, when they had an eligible daughter, would go to the study hall and look for a very sharp-witted, good Talmud student and take this young boy, if he agreed, as a son-in-law. The idea being that if he's smart in Talmud, maybe he'll be smart in other things. One could also ask, is studying Talmud make a person nice? And the answer is probably not. However, niceness is difficult to measure, and smartness is easy to measure. You can check a person's grades and say if they are smart or not, but it's difficult to give, say a person is 2.8 nice. We don't have ways of doing that. So that the boys in the studying in the Bet Midrash saw their future as studying intensively, doing very well in the study of Talmud, then marrying a rich man's daughter. They would live in the house of the rich man with their wife for a few years, and then they would go off into business on their own, but the father of the bride would give them a capital which would be enough for them to start off in life. So that this was the usual pattern in the yeshiva. Students did not usually look forward to a career as a rabbi. If they would go into business and they would not be successful, then they might decide that they would be a rabbi. But the goal was basically to have a comfortable life, which would give them lots of time to study. It's very much like a university. When a person is working at a university and teaching, they have all kinds of responsibilities in administration. They have to fill out reports. They have to fill out forms. So that people at the university are very happy to go on a grant to a different country where they don't have to teach, and all they can do is study, and they don't have to deal with administration. This was the same goal in the yeshiva, to be able to study quietly. If the opportunity didn't exist, then you can become a rabbi and deal with all of the problems that rabbis deal with. So the system worked effectively. There were always rich people, not many, but there were some. Boys studied if they had the tools, intellectual ability, and when they were married and they had children, if the children were talented, they would go through the same route. How then was the dynamic inside the study hall or the Bet Midrash? There were the people who gave food, who invited students, people who lived in the community. Among the students themselves, there was no writing. They didn't write papers. There were no tests. And there was always competition as to who would be the smartest and who would be the most talented. There was constant discussion among students. It was what you could call controlled aggression. It's, for example, if you see students at the university who are competing for a prize, they can gather together before the competition, before they have to present their papers, and they are all friendly, but at the same time, they know that one person will get the prize, and they want to be that person. And they try to balance being competitive with politeness. In certain fields, this gets exaggerated. I know that in fields like chemistry, sometimes students will go into the laboratory at night and destroy the experiments of somebody else who is competition. In history, we're nicer. So that in the yeshiva, in the Beit Midrash, there was always competition, and everybody knew who is the very best student, who is number 2, who is number 3. It wasn't a formal hierarchy, but it's one of those things that is known. Who is the best? And the young boys who would come to the Beit Midrash, they would want to be like the best student, and they would try to study hard in order to equal the achievements of the best student. And this was important because when the rich man came to look for a son-in-law, they wanted to be that person who would be taken and not anybody else in the Beit Midrash. So this system works well. However, informality has a price. If we take rich people in the year, say, 1800, there were certain skills that they needed in order to succeed in their business affairs. There was a need to have the knowledge of the languages spoken around them. There wasn't a need necessarily to write in Latin, but there was a need to speak in Polish or to speak in Ukrainian, or if in parts which were controlled by Russia, Russian, and parts were controlled by Austria, German. There was a need for languages, and people picked up spoken language, not necessarily written language. And the main thing was an ability to deal with people and to think carefully and quickly to recognize opportunities. However, in the course of the 19th century, there is more and more of a need for formal education, and more than a true need for education, a belief that education is important, even when it really was not important. But they believed it was important. And when this happens, then there is a problem. When the rich man begins to look for a son-in-law, where will he begin to look in, say, 1850? In different places. Not in the synagogue, but where will he look? Maybe in a gymnasium, maybe somebody who, circles of students who graduated a high school or a secondary school, ultimately in university circles, because these were boys which the rich people felt would be more promising in the long term. The opening of educational opportunities to enter general educational frameworks was one that was a new event in the, or new development in the Jewish community. And not surprisingly, the rich were among the first to recognize the significance of this educational opportunity. So what happened in the Beit Midrash? What did smart boys who realized the situation begin to do? If you're sitting in the Beit Midrash and learning Torah, and you realize where the opportunities are, what do you begin to study as well? What would be good to study? First thing is language. Whatever the language around you that is spoken and written. So, but to study the language and to get an ability not only to speak, but also to read, and hopefully not only to read, but to write, this was something very desirable. Could students do this independently? And the answer is, very intelligent students could, by working very, very hard. They were used to studying 16, 17, 18 hours a day Talmud, and if you study that intensively, a few hours a day of language can be done. There was a story of one rabbi who went from Europe to America. He learned English on the boat. How did he learn English on the boat? He read a dictionary from the first page to the last page, and when he got to New York, he knew the dictionary by heart. That doesn't mean he spoke eloquent English, but he knew all the words. Now, is this an average person? No. Most people cannot do this. But again, a person who has been trained for years to study intensively, sometimes they can. So that you had a fair amount of study and try an attempt to fit into the new economic and social realities. And here I'm talking about the mid-19th century on. Now, when students begin to read, there is no control over what they will read. And students also, especially if they grew up in the traditional Jewish society, have no idea which books are compatible with tradition and which books are not compatible with tradition. There was a famous American comedian whose name was Marx, Groucho Marx. And there were many jokes about people confusing Karl Marx and Groucho Marx. Because if you don't know Marx, what's the difference? So that students were open to almost anything and without much discretion. And very quickly, many students found themselves very much attracted by the ideas of modernity, of enlightenment, of rationalism, which they found very appealing and very significant, more than Talmud. What happened to them then? What happens when you have a student who says, this is more interesting? What is his next step? To open the door and go out. He doesn't need to be anymore studying Talmud all day in the university, in the synagogue. He may dream of going to university, being an extern student, preparing himself for advancement in a very different system. Or, if he was reading Marx, he could leave the Bet Midrash and become one kind of a revolutionary or another revolutionary. There are all kinds of options to do if you decide there is something better than Talmud. Now, what happens when this very bright boy, and it's usually the brightest who are the most interested in these things, decides to go out the door? What happens?
They didn't have money.
They didn't have money, so they had to beg. But what happened in the study hall? Have you ever watched sheep? When the first sheep goes, what do the other sheep do?
Follow.
They all follow. Now, there are two possibilities. If the sheep are by themselves, then the other sheep follow and they're lost. And that's why usually, if you have sheep, you also have a shepherd. You have somebody watching the sheep. And if the first one goes to the wrong place, then you bring them back. That's the dynamic. Now, in the Bet Midrash, was there a shepherd? No. There wasn't. It was all informal. It was very intensive. It was very effective as long as there was no alternative. When there was an alternative, there was a need for a shepherd. And there was no shepherd. Now, what is then the yeshiva? A yeshiva, what does it give? It's a framework which offers a shepherd. Now, it could be the sheep in the yeshiva want to go out, but there is a shepherd. And this was the key difference between a study hall, a Beit Midrash, a framework for informal education, and a yeshiva. Now, what is important, I think, is that the function of the head of a yeshiva is to be a shepherd. The function is not to be a teacher, because students are regarded as able to study by themselves very well. They can achieve a lot just by studying themselves. But what's needed is the guidance. However, some things developed which were not anticipated. And that's what I will try to present now. I will just mention that in the university, sometimes one wonders, are teachers necessary at the university? Because basically, you can read the books yourselves, get all of the knowledge. What is the point of having a teacher at the university? For that, you don't need a teacher. So then you can get a list at the beginning of the year. The function, I think the function of a university is to discuss and criticize. And that the criticism is the most valuable thing that one can get at the university. Criticism in a healthy sense. But the difference between an autodidact and somebody who has gone through university is the ability to measure one's ideas to other people's ideas. Now, the first yeshiva that we find in Eastern Europe was founded in 1803. Now that is not true. See, before you even write it down, I can tell you it's not true. There were yeshivot in the past. What is a yeshiva? A framework for the study of Talmud with a head, a director, a leader, who is called, in Hebrew or Yiddish, Rosh Yeshiva. Rosh means head, so it's very simple. Head of the yeshiva. There were yeshivot previously in Eastern Europe, but they went out of style. Why? Because the teacher really wasn't necessary. Informal education was so effective that it really wasn't necessary to go to the trouble of getting a structure to hire a head of a yeshiva, to pay, to have a framework, a building. All of these are added expenses. And if one can achieve this informally, that's fine. So that we find them in the past, but by 1800 there are no important yeshivot at all in Eastern Europe. And then all of a sudden we have one. Now, this yeshiva was founded in the Belarusian town of Volozhin by a rabbi named Chaim. The name is not important, but I'll tell you, so you might ask. Now, many articles have been written about this event, the founding of the first yeshiva. And the general impression is that this is part of a carefully thought out plan, because people like to think that important events have plans. Well, why would a rabbi establish in 1803 a yeshiva with a plan? What's his plan? He must have been against something. What could he be against? He could be against modernity. That would be very logical, and this was a strong structure, and it defended against modernity. There's only one problem, that in 1803, there wasn't much modernity in the Jewish world. So you could say he was a prophet, and he knew in 40 years that there was going to be modernity. And he was already prepared for that. So it reminds me a little bit about astrology. You familiar with astrology? There are all types of people who analyze the stars and tell you astrology. Okay. If any of these people would be millionaires because they bought Lectzia, because they knew in the stars which Lectzia would go up, then I would believe. But they don't buy the right Lectzia. They get people to give them money because they believe. Nah. There are no prophets today. Chaim did not see the future. But there was a contemporary competition. Which competition could there be for the study of Talmud? Hasidim. That he could have been opposed to Hasidim, and he would set up the yeshiva to have a framework so that boys would not go and visit Hasidic rabbis and become Hasidim. And he felt that Hasidim were not studying Talmud enough, and this would be a framework that would keep young people away from the terrible Hasidim. There is only one problem with that, or actually two. One is, we have many things that he wrote, and most of what he wrote, he did not say anything bad about Hasidim. He did write one book that was very much against Hasidim, and it was published in 1821. It's called, this is totally not important, Nefesh HaChaim is the name of the book. Now, what is the point which is interesting? If he was so opposed to Hasidim, what would he have done? He would have published the book when he was alive. People who think that something is important don't leave a manuscript to be published later. And the truth is, he was anti-Hasidism. He was not at all a Hasid, but he was not obsessive. He did not get involved in the fights. There were many fights between Hasidim and their opponents. He stayed out. So it's difficult to find a grand plan or a reason for establishing the yeshiva. However, if you look at his biography, it makes a little sense. He himself was born in the city of Volozhin, and he was a very brilliant Talmud student. And when he was young, he was very close to a famous rabbi in Vilnius, the Gaon of Vilna. He was very close to him. He was a student of his, and there were very few students. He was really unique, and he was famous for this. So he was a very well-known expert in Talmud, and after he became a little older, he became the rabbi of Volozhin. Now, if you will excuse me for the comparison, rabbis are a little bit like football players. Now, what happens if you get a really good football player, let's say in, let's see, what would be a good place to compare, I don't know, in Brody, all right? A really good football player in Brody. Brilliant. What will happen to him after a year or two? He'll go from Brody to where? To Kiev, or maybe Lviv, I don't know the football league, but he's not going to stay there. He's going to go to a bigger team. If he's really good, what's going to happen to him?
They will sell him to
Yeah.
Milano.
They will sell him to Milano or to Chelsea or to one of the German teams, München Gladbach. Now, first off, we talk about slaves. Here we have buying and selling people, which is an interesting topic. But this is the way you go up. And if you take a famous football club, there are players from all over the world there. This is, you go from a smaller town to a bigger town, and you go up. The same thing with rabbis. You start off as a rabbi in a small town, you become famous, and you go to a bigger town. People want to have a famous rabbi in their community. So Rabbi Chaim Volozhin started in Volozhin, became famous. He went then to another community, Vilkomir, now it's in Ukraine, in Belarusian it's Ukmerj, no, it's in Lithuanian it's Ukmerj. So, but he went there, and he was rabbi there for 1 year. And then he got in a fight with the rich people in the community. And if you remember what I mentioned about rabbis, rabbi is not a position for life. The people who bring him can also fire him. And after a year, he left. He was very hurt, very insulted. He went back to Volozhin, and he didn't want to go away. Again, he wanted to be in his home. However, there was a problem. He was still famous, but he was in Volozhin, and it was a small town. And what did they have in this small town? Like every town, where there was a Jewish community, there was a synagogue and a study hall. And boys came to the study hall to study. So they heard, there's a famous rabbi, he's very smart, he's very good at explaining things. So more and more boys came to the study hall in this poor town of Volozhin. And then very quickly there was a problem. What was the problem? What? Too many boys and not enough rich people. Now the simple solution would be to import rich people to invite the boys for meals. However, it's very difficult. Chaim of Volozhin himself was rich, but he didn't know what to do. So the boys came, and he had a very soft heart. You know, if boys would come, they say, "Rabbi, we want to study, we want to be able to ask you questions, but we don't have any food." And they really didn't have food. So what did he do? Put his hand in his pocket, and then here, take a ruble, buy some food, go to the store and eat something and study. You can do this once, you can do this twice, but it got to be impossible. So then, he had basically two options. One would be, he could go to be a rabbi in a bigger city, where there was a study hall and more people to invite. But he already did that one time. He did not want to do that again. You know people like that. One time it doesn't work, they'll never try it again. So, if you cannot go to a bigger city, what solution can you have? Now, here he was in luck. His former patron or teacher had been the rabbi of the Gaon of Vilna. He was not the rabbi of the city, but he lived in the city. He was the Gaon of Vilna. And some of his other students had gone to live in Israel as part of a half messianic view, the desire to live in the Holy Land. And they went to Israel, and of course, what was their problem after they came in Israel? They didn't have any money. So what did their friends do who were still in Lithuania and in Poland? What did they do? Collected money and sent it to them in Israel. Now, why would anybody give money to send to Israel? There were enough poor people wherever, in the same places where people lived. Israel was special. Why? The land is holy. So these are holy people in a holy land. One collects for them. And guess who was responsible to collect the money? One guess. What? Rabbi Chaim. He was the one who was responsible. So, he had a good idea. The same way I collect money for the poor people who went to Israel, I can collect money for the poor boys. But I have to tell people, why should they send money? So I have to say there's something special here. So what did he begin to do? He began to give regular classes in the study hall. And that meant that what was he? He was now a Rosh Yeshiva. And he could say, we have a yeshiva, and this is a special institution. Why? There aren't any other yeshivas. Hundreds of years ago, there had been yeshivas, but now there aren't. But I have one here in Volozhin, and it is special. Excuse me. And because of that, I need to collect money for the students. And he did. He was very successful. He collected money for the students. And of course, success is a problem. Why? when he collected money for the students, what happened? Let me give you an example. Let us say I am a very generous person and I am a very nice person. If I would give all of you, even you, each one as a reward for participation in this class, a 2-week vacation in Provence with meals, hotel and meals and airplane. That would be very nice for me. Correct? Now, if I did that right now, pulled out, here it is, write a check, what would happen tomorrow in this room? I can tell you what would happen. People would be sitting in the window, right? All they have to do is hear about. I would give you also. Then they would be standing in the hall. So that good news simply means that more students come. So that the problem wasn't really solved. He raised money for the students and then more came. Why? Because accidentally he found a very important idea. When the students go to eat at somebody's house for a meal, basically, what are they like? To what are they similar? Who else goes around to houses to get food? Beggars. They're like beggars. They're high-class beggars, but they're beggars. They need mercy from people to give them food. And you could see the boys at the table looking at that potato there, and they didn't know, will they give me that potato, or are they going to give me the little one? They're beggars. But in Volozhin, each boy got money, and what did he do with the money? He bought food. He's not a beggar. He is a person who buys, and the people in the store are very happy to see him, and there's competition. Come to my store, come to my store. Or what boys would do is they would rent a room, and they would pay for their meals with the room. But they were paying. And this gives them status. And this is much better than being a beggar. So that the number of students grew. So as the number of students grew in the study hall, there began to be problems. Why were there problems? People from Volozhin would come to synagogue to say their prayers, and what happened? There's no room. All of the seats are taken by the students who are studying, getting the money from the rabbi. You know, imagine if you have a concert, and before the concert, all the students come in, and then people come in with their tickets. 1 or 2 people, you can deal with it, but everybody comes in with their tickets, and the students say, not today, we're here first. It's impossible to deal with it. So what did Reb Chaim have to do? He had to build a separate building. And then, what is that? Without even thinking, you have a school building. And then you have student organization, because it's just the students without the people from the community. And it's a very intensive dynamic. So Reb Chaim set up a school, but it was really by accident. It wasn't with thinking a plan for the next 10 years, but one thing, if you put your hand in your pocket to give somebody money for food, then you have to do it again, and then your pocket is not big enough, so you get money, and then one thing leads to another, and you find yourself in charge of a school, which will ultimately be quite impressive and influential. So this is what happened. What happens, and this is, I think, an important, that doesn't mean I'm right, but this is what I think. What happens when historians look back at it? Historians do not like to say that things happen by accident. They like to find deep meanings and plans and ideas, and sometimes there are deep meanings and plans. But sometimes things happen by accident. So this yeshiva was set up. Reb Chaim did give a class every day in the yeshiva. But he found that very often he had to travel and to collect money. And this is a problem. Once you start giving classes, then when you travel to collect money, then what will happen with the classes? So what did he need? Another teacher. So then you begin to have staff. And this he solved elegantly by bringing in relatives to be the other teachers in the institution. We tend to think that bringing relatives in is not a good thing. So if the rector here would bring in his cousin or his nephew, I suppose there would be a lot of talk. But there are certain virtues, because if a nephew comes in, what will the nephew not do to the rector? He won't argue with his uncle. His uncle is his uncle. His uncle is older. His uncle is influential. So this solves a lot of problems of relationships in an institution. It also can create problems, but in the beginning it solves problems. So Reb Chaim brought in relatives to teach, and the yeshiva functioned now with a staff. However, it was still a new kind of institution. There were students who came, not because they liked his classes, but for what reason? They liked the financial support. Now, what is the great worry, or what makes a teacher afraid at the university? Teachers are afraid that if they have a student who does not study with them, he doesn't come to class. He stays home. But he is very successful. Why are teachers afraid of that? Because it means that they aren't needed. They're superfluous. Superfluous is a big word to say not needed. So teachers like to think that what they say and what they do is important. There is some importance to it. But serious independent study can do a great deal. That's the goal. So that in the yeshiva, which has had a tradition of a study hall, what was optional? It was not necessary to go to the class. If you wanted to, you did. If you don't, you don't. And there were many students who were at the yeshiva who did not go to classes. They studied by themselves, and they found that more productive. What did Reb Chaim say about that? Good. He liked that. He himself never went to classes. That's the way he grew up. I remember when I was a student, like you, one day I started reading, what was it? Crime and Punishment. And I started reading, and then it was time for class. And I decided that Crime and Punishment is more important than going to hear a lecture on history. And I sat and I read it until I was finished. And I think I was right. Yep. When you're doing something right, you don't have to do something else. Except if it's my class you come to. So that in the yeshiva, many students did not go to the class, and there were those who did. It was an option. The main thing was to study. What about grades and tests? There were no grades and tests. Why? Very simply. Reb Chaim could not give a test and a grade. Why could he not give a test and a grade? A 90, an 80, a 70?
Difficult to measure.
You're too intelligent. That's a problem. It's even simpler. What?
It was another measurement.
It was another measurement. He talked to boys. He knew what they understood.
And he promoted the best students.
And he promoted the best. But in order to give a test, what simple thing is necessary? The person who gives the test has to himself had a test. Rabbi Chaim had never seen a test in his life. He never went to a school with tests. He had never given a grade. Now, between you and me, sometimes we get a grade 94 or 92. Is there any way to see the difference between 94 and 92? No. There is no way that you can see how somebody is 2 points more or 2 points less. There's no way. It's all people give numbers, they give a feeling of precision. A difference between a 98 and a 68, you can see there's a difference. But 73 and 75, there's no way you can see that small a difference. Reb Chaim would not have understood the idea of giving a number to a person. You measure a person by his total abilities and you describe him, but not through numbers or A, B, C. So for him, it was incomprehensible. He didn't even think of it. So that if he didn't think of it, he also didn't do it. So in the yeshiva, study continued as in the past, with same intensity, except that for those boys who wanted a chance to discuss topics in a Talmud with a very smart person, they had a class. Now, what is important looking at a new kind of an institution? How can you measure if it is important or not? Now let's talk about cell phones. Cell phones, as you know, is something that I find very interesting. What do we know about things that are important in cell phones? Let's say that one company has the brilliant idea of putting a camera on the cell phone. This was not obvious. The first cell phones did not have cameras. Why? They were imitating regular telephones that were in the homes with a wire. And no telephone in a home with a wire has a camera on it. So the first cell phones were just cell phones. Then when Apple came out with the first smartphone, what did they add? A camera. Because it's the right size, it's mobile, and you can transmit photographs. What happened after Apple put a camera on the cell phone? Everybody did. Imitation. The word the companies use is emulation, which is the same thing. Imitation. So we can learn what is important by measuring imitation. Institutions, products, whatever you want. If it is imitated, then you see that it's something worthwhile or possibly worthwhile and productive. If it's not imitated, then it isn't. Music, you see this all the time. So if we look at Volozhin, if we want to say, was it important when it was established, then we have to say, it's a very good idea, organizationally it works. Now we have to see, was it imitated? And if I ask the question this way, what will the answer be? You know, if somebody makes a long introduction, the answer has to be no. It was established, it was effective, but it was not imitated. It was like a special service on a cell phone, which is nice, but nobody else has to copy it. When did the structure of the yeshiva begin to be important? Not in 1803, when modernization is not a problem, when new ideas and values are not a problem. When did the yeshiva begin to be important? Later. Around the middle of the century, at the time when good students in the study halls were beginning to decide that Talmud is not enough. And then they were reading books that asked questions about religion, that asked questions about theology, and they could not find by themselves answers in the books that they were reading. And if they didn't find answers, then they decided that the books were wrong. So until the mid-century, there aren't very many other yeshiva. There's one more important yeshiva that's founded in the city of Mir, but that was an exception. There are the two yeshivas. After the middle of the century, then the number of yeshivas begins to grow rapidly in Lithuania, and then the idea began to spread to more countries. Where will it spread to? It will spread to any place where boys are beginning to leave tradition. And there's a feeling that it's now necessary to find a way to keep them within the tradition. Now, basically, for believers, there is a great difficulty to understand somebody who does not believe. It's not just a question of belief in religion, but religion is a good example. If you believe in God, how can somebody not believe in God? If you believe in one religion or another, it's so obvious. And then what happens if somebody begins to say, I don't believe? Then what do believers do? They get angry. Why do people get angry? Because they don't have a real answer. They're not able to explain why they believe. But why do they believe? Because it's obvious. Let me give you an example. If you go to a restaurant in Lviv, you can buy meat of a pig, meat of a cow, sheep, maybe if you look carefully, goats, chickens, few birds. Now, you can tell me, I don't know. Is there any restaurant in Lviv where you can buy dog meat? Probably not. Now, my guess is if somebody opened a restaurant with dog meat, a lot of people would be very unhappy. How can you take a dog and kill it and cook it? Now, is there any logical reason to make a distinction between a dog and a sheep, or a dog and a chicken? An animal is an animal. But this is something that we are simply, many people find impossible. And if you begin to discuss it with them, they'll get very angry. Why? Because they have a weakness with it. What is an interesting taboo, which is a very interesting taboo, is cannibalism. How people are terribly upset by cannibalism. And also, you can ask whatever you want to ask about it. So, people who are believers find it very difficult to deal with people who do not believe, and they don't understand. The only person who can really discuss well with a non-believer is a believer who doesn't, has himself or herself dealt with questions of belief. But people who grow up inside find it very difficult. Now, from the 1850s on, as the younger generation found many of the best or the most intelligent of the younger generation found no answers to their questions in tradition, then and left, this created a great great sense of threat within traditional society. Now, if one looked at statistics, one could say very logically, why should they feel threat? In 1860, 1870, 1880, what percent of the Jewish community was saying, I don't believe anymore. I don't think that God really cares what food I eat. There's kosher food, I know, but why should God care if I eat kosher food or not kosher food? Is that really what bothers God? Or does it bother God what I do on the Sabbath or not? I can understand God is concerned if I am a good human being or a bad human being. But why should He care about silly rituals? And you can make the list longer and longer, so that there were people who left tradition and many integrated into general society, and many did not. But how many were there? In 1860, very few. 1%. 1880, maybe 5–10%. We're dealing in very small numbers. Why then should this have been regarded as such a threat within the Jewish community? Now, there were always people who were rebels and who were not observant and who were on the margins of society. But let's say in 1800, where were these misbehaving people? Where were they in Jewish society? They were at the bottom. There were Jewish thieves. Did the thieves always say their blessings? I promise you, they didn't. They weren't very nice, and they stole and they did bad things. They were robbers. But where were they in Jewish society? On the bottom. This was the marginal population. And that people can understand. These are people who are bad people. They're bad in one way, they're bad in another way. But what was the problem with the non-believers or the modernizers in 1860 and 1870? Where were they? They weren't, the people on the bottom, the thieves and the robbers, they stayed not observant. But where was the growth in numbers? Not in the bottom, but where? And not in the middle. Middle class, you have to know, is very conservative, always. Where was the rebellion and the leaving of tradition? Well, we don't have anywhere left. What's left? What? The elite. This small percentage, the 2, 5, 10%, the number was growing, was very heavily represented in the elite. Why? If you want to be a rebel, you need money from your parents and you need support. It's very difficult to be a rebel when you have to work all day and earn a living. That's why the middle class is so conservative. If you want to study, and ideally if you want to go to a secondary school, if you want to go to university, where is the population that does that? From the elite. It's the people who have the finances. Even if university is free, which it isn't, but where is the bottleneck? What makes it difficult to get into university? Preparation. Let's take this university. What is one of the requirements to succeed at this university? Very simple. You have to know English, because so much is written in English. You can say you don't like it, you can say it's not fair, but that's life. And I teach in Israel, I taught in Israel. There are fields in Israel where there is nothing in Hebrew. In physics or in chemistry, even the teachers write only in English. They're going to write physics in Hebrew for who? For 5 other physicists in Israel? There's nothing in Hebrew. And it's the same thing everywhere in the world now. So that if you want to succeed at the university, you have to know English. So even if the university gives a scholarship to students who do not have money, but to get to the point of being a student, they have to have preparation. And therefore, this, not officially, but very effectively, means that students from a big city have a big advantage over students from a small town, where simply they aren't exposed as much to English. Is this fair? Is it equal? No. But that's life. So that in the 1860s, 1870s, the crisis was in the elite. And why was this felt so much? Because the people who studied Talmud in the Beit Midrash always thought that when they finished studying Talmud, they would marry a rich man's daughter, and then everything will be fine. We can imagine a situation, to go back to football, in which the government of Ukraine could make an interesting decision. that as part of a program of international relations, starting next year, there will no longer be football leagues, but basically everywhere boys will start playing baseball, which is an American game. It's just as stupid as football. I mean, you go to a football game and you see thousands of people screaming because a ball went here and the ball didn't go there. And that's very, very important. Where did the ball go? 2 centimeters here or 2 centimeters there? That you can scream. But they can make a decision that from now on in Ukraine we will play baseball and develop international ties and not football. I don't think this could happen, but it might. Now, one thing is for sure, there would be thousands of boys who would be very disappointed because all of their plans had been to be stars in football, and now they have to learn another sport in which you have to hit a ball instead of kicking a ball. And that's the big difference. So that you have this situation in which you can imagine shifting of values, and we can think of this in other areas as well, which are more sensitive. So that when you do have shifts, or when people switch from, say, football to basketball, which is more possible, then those people who support the traditional game, or in terms of religion, those people who support the traditional religion or patterns feel threatened. And it is precisely in the world of the elite that this happens. The Talmud scholars did not come from the middle of society or the bottom, but they came from the elite. But the elite was now changing. New people were coming into the elite. New skills were being recognized. And the traditional values no longer had a place in society. And this meant that the framework of the Bet Midrash, or the communal study hall, was changing quickly. How is it changing? Boys were leaving, and the system basically began to collapse. First in big cities, and then these changes came in smaller cities. Now, to meet this shift, the model of the yeshiva suddenly became very important. Here was a structure that already existed that could be used now not only to improve the level of study, but to find a way to stop young boys from leaving the tradition. Because in this institution, there was some discipline, and there was also some more isolation from the community around. However, discipline and isolation are not enough. It's also necessary to have a strategy. So what I want to deal with tomorrow is what was the strategies that developed to deal with modernity. How do you fight modernity? And I'll also try to discuss a little bit the role of women in these shifts. One thing is clear. The modern world presents challenges to tradition. Tradition has to respond to the modern world. And these responses are something new. And if they're new, what are they? They are modern. So if you want to fight the modern world, you have to be modern, but modern in a different way. These people who are fighting the challenges, they will say, me? I'm not modern. But the minute somebody says, I am not modern, what is he? Modern. There is nothing more modern than to be against what is modern. So, we will stop here, and tomorrow will be the lecture where I'll try to fill things up. I meant to leave a few minutes for questions, but you didn't stop me with questions, and then I got interested in the topic myself. But if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer. Okay, you know the rule. You're not allowed to ask questions. Everybody wants to go home. But tomorrow you can ask.